Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of Shagalenko TV. My name is Ambassador Emmanuel Gabari, and this is also saying that today's episode we'll be looking at youth development, what the private and public sector can do in terms of philanthropy, pulling in resources together and making sure they empower young people and the community around them. We'll be talking with Mr. Katlego Chibamba. He's a South African and also an African philanthropy practitioner. He'll be telling us more what the private and public sector can do together and move the society and their community forward. I know I used to hear of corporate social responsibilities where companies or organizations that are within a community, a state or a region or a country can put resources together and then empower people around there, or even do things that will take the lives of the citizens to the next level. Anyways, let's hear from Mr. Katlego what he thinks about African philanthropy and what's the way forward. Don't go nowhere, we'll be right back.
I am Katlego Chibamba. I am the African philanthropy practitioner, a fellow of the Association of Black Foundation Executive, the first fellow from Africa who happens to be on the Connecting Leaders Fellowship program. I am from South Africa, particularly in Cape Town, but I was born in Kimberley in the Northern Cape province.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk a little about young people. Let's talk about youth development, and then we'll come back and do all of that. What are the peculiar things that you think binds African young people together, whether they be South Africans, East Africans, West Africans? What are some of the things you found out in the field that, binds them together, whether it's their strength or their weakness?
This conversation around the youth is particularly important, especially in this month of June, because in South Africa we commemorate young people, we commemorate the youth, particularly the 16th of June, which commemorates the youth of 1976. Their bravery, their resilience, particularly in their contribution towards the realization of the democracy that we see today in South Africa. Your question is very important in the sense that when we speak of Africa beyond, the youth in Africa beyond the border controls, there is a lot of connection. There is a lot of power in terms of sharing. Currently, I am in Abuja in Nigeria, meeting with my fellow young people who share in the same sort of energy in terms of providing changes in their communities. And there is so much similarities in terms of what we wish to see of the African continent and of the very communities that we find ourselves living in, which currently is at the helm of political power, but more so at the demise of economic power. You find that young people across the African continent are continuing to empower themselves, especially with education, but unfortunately are met with the brunt of unemployment as soon as they finish acquiring the qualification, which is really a big problem. And it's a problem that is across the continent, which I clearly feel, political will is not doing much for it. And in as much as they may say they are doing something about it, corruption that they continue to show across states, across borders, it's so bad that it's starting to even impact not just state resources, but the very lives that we currently hold. Young people are unemployed because of the impacts of corruption, because of the lack of community development, because of the lack of investment in terms of property, in terms of development as a whole. As soon as that political will is to be realized and to be used correctly, we'll start to see changes. We'll start to see legal and law reform happen. We'll start to see changes in terms of constitutional rights that will enable young people to participate equally also in the economy. We'll start to see laws that ensure that they also put business into some sort of a will that is responsible not only for generating profits for themselves, but for ensuring that they develop the communities to which they to be quite honest, globalization happens everywhere. Globalization happens because people across the world move. People have been moving for centuries. We find ourselves where we find ourselves because of the very aspects of movement. And when we look back at how the very urban areas that we find ourselves to have lived in for all these number of years, those urban areas were not there before. You know, the influx that you find happening in urban areas today is something that also happened many, many years ago. Majority of the people that find themselves living in urban areas are from the rural areas. Majority of them have homes, have families in the rural areas. And when we talk about development, what kind of development? Are we talking about a European or a British style development? Do we want to see big buildings, high-rise buildings in communities or in our rural areas? No. What we want in our rural areas is for us to be able to also somehow integrate the easiness of the changes that happen in the world. We need to have remote rural villages. You know, the world is changing in the sense that people are not, today there's transportation. You know, there's cars, there's technology that is happening. It cannot happen only in some parts of the world and not be reached in some other parts of the world. There are some rural areas that don't want that sort of new ways of doing things. And those communities should be preserved and should be left alone. But then there are those other rural areas that you find that, you know, they appreciate the changes that are happening in the world. And it is on that basis that those should be also prioritized when it comes to being given access to roads, access to technology, access to means that are enabling them to be able to interact with the rest of the world. You know, it is an excuse that has been used many a times to say rural communities are far and fetched and stretched, and therefore a lot of money would need to be invested. Not all rural areas want to do that. So applying the whole blanket approach to all different rural communities, it's very dangerous, because in some instances, they themselves, those who are in power, and I particularly mean political power, the government, if you need me to be very specific, and governments across the African continent, because this is the focus, this is where I come from, my motherland, they are very selfish. You find that they would want to bring the means of development to communities or rural communities where they may have identified a couple of possible resources for themselves. There are a lot of mines that have been developed across rural villages. And when they discover those resources, those mineral resources, you know what they do? They don't come with the intention of, no, we want to. They go and they forcefully remove people from those spaces. They close them and turn those spaces into roads that are able to move. And if that is something that is possible to do, because then there is a resource that you found, that says to me that there is a possibility that, you know, the very communities where those resources are found can be developed and changed as quickly. It is truly disheartening that when it comes to election time, those problems seems to not be a major issue for politicians when they have to either fly through helicopters or drive to the communities. But as soon as they are in positions of power or in government where they are able to bring about changes, where they are able to influence the constitution, where they are able to influence the laws and bring about change, they tend to take forever, because they've created systems for themselves that for some reason are incapable of being changed. We need a new world order. And if you are not careful, the very youth that you're talking about will bring that revolution. They've been able to do that throughout the years. The very same people that are in power today were able to bring changes to their communities at the time when they were young. Today, they are using this whole expertise of their age and their experience as a means to why they're able to make sound and effective decisions. But they're very slow. That seems to not be the case, because by the time they were making those revolutionary changes, they were young, they were very vibrant, they were able to change the world. They could run, they could throw stones, they could challenge systems. They were arrested. Some of them died when they were quite young, when they were still in the youth. And after many years now, you find them in their old age, in their 50s, in their 60s. In fact, not 50s. Many of them, you find that they are over 60. And now they want to use their elderly status, their dignitary status, to come and oppress us. Our time is now, and our time, we are saying, we are still seeking this conversation. Because initially, this is how change is brought, through conversations. But keep ignoring us. You will see. You will see. There's change that is coming, and it's coming in all different directions. The emergence of the economic freedom fighters, which I'm not necessarily a member of, is but an example of such, because it's there across the African continent. There is also this element of millennials that business is currently feeling today. That element of power is coming. You can tell with higher institutions of learning, the fees must fall that happened in South Africa. The very much changes the protests that you find happening across universities is beautifully so. Philanthropy has played a major role in terms of community development, in terms of social justice development, in terms of socio-economic development as well. Currently in Africa, 2/3 of the donor funding that we find coming in comes from philanthropists, but philanthropists from outside of the African continent, which is aimed at, strides have been made by philanthropy in terms of the realization of HIV and AIDS, in terms of the research that is currently happening in the continent, in terms of the provision of ART and ARV kinds of medication, particularly to those people that may be infected and affected by HIV and AIDS, as well as preventative mechanisms. This seems to be a big role that is currently new. African philanthropy development is at its infant stage in Africa. It's still an area that seeks to be explored more. Yes, there are strides that are made. For example, there are a couple of philanthropists in the African continent who are leaders. For example, your Strides Masiwa, your Patrice Motsepe, or Aleko Dankote foundations, who have given millions and millions of their money towards the development of African communities, towards the African philanthropy development. And I still think there is a huge element and a huge role that can also be played by corporate philanthropy, and shifting away from the elements of charity, which we find a lot, especially corporate businesses doing through their CSR or CSI programs. There should be deliberate philanthropy that is given, that is intentional, that is hearty, but at the same time that foresees change, as opposed to a once-off charity event where people give millions, but then once they've done that, they don't go back to those communities to see how it is that those millions may have benefited the communities, or how it is that some of those millions may have created further needs for development and for continuous relationship that needs to be built. It should also go through intention. It's giving shouldn't just be a corporate investment that is done as a result of an event, which we find happening quite often. There is currently Pride Month, which is an American corporate term in terms of celebrating LGBTI people across the world. We find a lot of corporate businesses, your major multinationals, showing sort of unity in terms of having the rainbow flag there and there. And these are traditionally the kinds of companies that you don't ordinarily find saying anything of that nature. But you find that what they also happen to do in months like this, they would either create events that are more inclusive and they invite LGBTI people in their spaces and then give a little bit of money, and that's it. We need to move away from that. We need to move away from giving that is profit margin line influenced into the giving that is really meaningful, that is intentional, that is about changing communities, deliberate changing of communities and individuals. And if it means striving towards philanthropy, I mean, you can corporate companies don't have to think 10 times about how they need to restructure themselves to be able to fit into philanthropy. They do that already with their strategies in terms of developing institutional culture, in terms of developing their institutional policies. That could just be an extension of what it is that they do institutionally, to say we are an institution that cares about the communities that we often we find ourselves working with, because the very same individuals that contributes towards the wellness of the organization, that contributes towards the organization being able to create these profits, are the very same people that come from those underdeveloped communities. Some of their lower level employees use public transportation, come from those very underdeveloped communities. They face a lot of challenges, as opposed to those who may be in executive positions and may have worked so hard and they may live comfortable lives in at least comfortable, safer cities and safer areas, and may not necessarily be able to observe and get to be in the brunt of poverty, to be in the brunt of under-resourced, of service, and of not receiving enough adequate service deliveries. They too can play a role. They too can play a role in ensuring that they help communities develop. Because all in all, the truth of the matter is, in as much as we've given so much power to the government or to the business sector, it cannot work alone. We need multiple hands. We need multiple thoughts that come together in terms of developing communities and individuals. I'd say, looking at the African context, we were saved somehow by Mother God. Of course, COVID-19 came and shattered us because it took away our loved ones, but not in the way that the world was expecting. Africa happens to be a playground for many other things. Globally, it's known as the home of diseases and viruses, and had this COVID-19 pandemic reached only in Africa, trust me, by now I'm not sure if we would still have a vaccine. We would be dying like ants. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. It affected the very, very first world countries, hit them very hard, and it is on that basis that urgency in terms of the development of vaccines was seen. And you see that because what did they do? They started hoarding the very vaccines that were there. Africa was at the demise because, hey, we didn't have the resources for that. But who do we have to blame for all of that? Our very own politicians, who continue to loot government, who continue, in the face of poverty, in the face of a pandemic. That is when I really got to realize that, you know what? We live with amongst selfish individuals who continue to play this power role, who I'm not even sure if they can even recognize who they are themselves in these very respectable positions of power. A lot of governments there was money donated towards the addressing of the scourge of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the country where I come from, South Africa. Billions of rands were set aside. And this is despite the fact that our countries are owing billions and billions to the World Bank, to global economic institutions that keep lending governments money for development. But you know what happens? The money comes in, and the money first gets onto the hands of those who have access to making the decisions, and those predominantly are politicians. And they don't play. They loot and they steal. And you know who that benefits? Their families. It doesn't benefit the very communities they come from, and the communities they live with. And it's so sad, because what they then do is they come back to our very communities and flash those things. We see their houses in a very poor community. It's that always that big affluent house that is, you know, it's this grandiose. It's so sad. But what I think we could do for ourselves is, you know, be much more open to finding our own ways of actually generating an income. There's so many ways in which we are able to generate income. But even before we generate income, let us find ways to promote agriculture. Because in that way, we are able not to create just food for others, but for ourselves. Because that's the most important thing. You know, communities need to be able to at least make sure that every household has a garden that is able to sustain every family for everyday food, so that at least once we have that, we are then able to see how we are going to contribute towards exchanging. If I have a garden of carrots in my house, and my neighbor has a garden of cabbage, and then another one has a garden of yam, and another one has a garden of potatoes, you can imagine we are able to then come back into the barter trading system, which really originated in where we come from. You give me a little bit of what you have, I take a little bit of what we have. At the end of the day, we are well fed. We are well fed the right nutritions. We are able to then fight better. We are able to develop much more stronger immune systems to be able to entertain the world, and to even entertain, you know, the way the systems of the world around business, around creating profit margins, around competing economically with the world's tools. We are able to do that in a much broader way. I mean, there are countries and there are communities that are in the lead front of this. China is developing because there are actually tribes that are continuing this. Every family, before they take out their things and send them to Africa, they themselves have been able to either learn how to sew, how to make shoes, so these are families that are able to produce a lot of these things and then find ways to make sure that they send them to the rest of the world, and then they benefit. And that's how they're able to compete with the rest of the world in terms of resources, in terms of money. It's not just expecting handouts. But it's a game that really, I feel, it's at the mercy of everyone on the table. And the people that are sitting on the two ends of the table, it's the government, which holds power, that holds governmental power, and business, the economic sector, which really holds strong economic power. These are the two power heads that needs to make sure that the rest of the table is fed, the rest of the table is well taken care of, instead of always pocketing themselves and getting themselves unhealthily big by not eating well, by also making sure that they keep stealing money and not even investing it in Africa. They take this money and invest it in Swiss accounts,
Wow, it's been an amazing one, and thank you so much to our guests for finding time to talk with us on African Philanthropy. And also thank you to everyone who watched, and thanks once again to everyone who is a regular viewer of this show from across the world. We truly appreciate. This is to also say that the videos are still here on YouTube, on Facebook, on all our social media platforms. Do well to like all our social media platforms. It is at Chagalenko TV. And yes, remember when you go to the YouTube, click on the notification button as well, so that every time we come on air, it will notify you and you can be part of the show. I want to sincerely thank everyone who joined us on today's episode. Let's do it again soon. God bless you all, and remember to touch a life. Once again, my name is Ambassador Emmanuel Gabari, and this is thanking our guest, Mr. Katlego Chibamba, a South African and an African philanthropy practitioner. Till we see you on the other side, take care of yourselves and bye-bye.